I'll put my screen share back on. Okay. And can everyone see the slides?
Yeah.
Super.
And
okay.
I think you can advance to mine if I can just quickly introduce myself and then hand it over to Tom. Hey everyone, it's so good. I'm seeing some new faces, some faces from around the Chicago area and beyond, several HANA members that I've studied with. For those of you that haven't met me yet, I have been using Salesforce for way too long. Back in late 2012, early 2013 is when my nonprofit was vetting systems and we landed on Salesforce as our CRM. However, I didn't meet anybody in the community and I didn't know all these wonderful things about the power of the community until I was a Rad Women learner in 2018. I was learning to code with a group of women virtually, and it just blew my mind in a way that it inspired me to resign from the job that I was at, where I was near burnout and just really needing something new. And I decided to dream bigger, and I went into higher ed. And I was there for just under 2 years in higher ed, and then I pivoted over into the consulting space. So I've worn some of the hats of many of us have different roles, those of you that are on the call today that I've heard. And so I hope that part of what I share as part of my journey here can really resonate with you and where you are at with DevOps. But yes, I'm currently at Slalom, not only a Salesforce MVP, but also a Capado champion and a gear set leader. That's how much I love DevOps, that I just spend all my time learning and skilling up and learning new tools and new features and better ways to adopt with DevOps. And yeah, I'm also a well-architected ambassador. So I'll kick it over to Tom, who will be my partner in DevOps fun here on this presentation.
Thanks, Blanca. If you get anything out of this today, it's that DevOps is not fun. No, it's great. When we go to the next slide, it's going to look a lot lighter when it comes to all the things that Blanca has achieved. Can we go back one, Rachel?
Rewind one, Rachel.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Tom Gelo. You may have seen me on LinkedIn. That's probably it. I've not been a part of this community until I met Blanca, who just in her exuberance and ability to be who she is, just gave me that bug to start doing more with the Salesforce community, the Trailblazer community. So I was lucky enough to get a co-lead for the architect community in Philadelphia with Andres Catalan, who I've known for, oh my gosh, probably at least 5 years now when he came to Slalom. It's great working with him. But as for myself, I've been working with Salesforce since about 2006, which not the earliest person possibly on this call. Every once in a while, we do run into people who started in like 2002. But I know what classic is very dark times. I wrote an S control or like 20 of them. And if you know what an S control is, more power to you. It's kind of interesting how the ecosystem has evolved since then. So I started in industry. I joined a company to be a data warehouse analyst. That data warehouse never got built. No surprise there. And the Salesforce admin for that company just left one day. And my boss at the time was like, you know, this computer stuff. I did go to school for computer science and programming. He's like, just try. And that was it. It was all downhill from there, as they say. And this is, again, it was because it was before Apex, because it was before Visual Force. I got the benefit of learning my craft as it became possible, where the developer notes were a lot smaller. There was no Stack Exchange. We just figured things out, and you could still do that today. I think it's a great way to get experience. And so I went back and forth from industry, learning that I needed to be challenged more in my career. So I went into consulting, went back again into industry when I was having a second in my family, and I wanted to be closer to home, and I found a job that was minutes away. I live outside of Philadelphia. And then same thing, about 3.5 years later, I got the bug again, and I'm like, Salesforce is really starting to pick up now. Industry clouds were coming out. technology was changing. And so I joined Slalom in 2015, and it's been great. I've been here for about 8.5 years, the longest I've been anywhere. But at that time, knowing that this ecosystem was expanding as quickly as it was, I started my CTA journey. It was something I had thought about, but nothing I had taken seriously. And it's a whole nother conversation, a whole nother story, but it was a challenge, as we all know. I sat 3 times. I took 3 section retakes. I finally did pass in 2020, right around December of that year, in my basement during COVID, which who knew that sitting for CTA was going to be a virtual experience, probably now and forever. But I learned a lot, even in working with Salesforce for that long. I learned a lot about myself and a lot about the platform, things that were just blind spots. So if you're ever thinking about CTA, it's a great experience. Even if you don't get it, if you devote your time and your energy to it, I think it's worth it. And then as I kind of transitioned from that CTA role at Slalom to possibly moving into a different part of this company, I noticed that there were, let's just say, a bit of a blind spot when it came to Salesforce DevOps, not only with just the ecosystem. There were so many tools out there, of course, but just in general around knowledge, around enablement, and more specifically within Slalom itself, I saw an opportunity to start a Salesforce DevOps practice, which is a bit unique. And I just figured that I hadn't been hands-on coding in a little while. I assumed with SFDX now and these off-the-shelf tools, things had gotten a lot easier, a lot better. They have gotten better. They didn't get any easier. And in diving into Salesforce DevOps as a kind of a second life with Salesforce, I've learned a lot about the developer lifecycle and a lot about the things that make it what it is and why is it different. So we're going to jump into that today a little bit. This is by no means the be all end all. This is what DevOps is for Salesforce, because you just, when you think you learned something, there's a new product out, or there's a new way to tackle an issue, or somebody else has a great idea and it starts becoming another tool to use. You'll see that as we kind of dive into this, there's a technical lens and there's a non-technical lens to this problem. And being in a low-code environment, it makes a lot of sense to start being very thoughtful around how you approach these issues. And with that, I think Blanca will move on and we'll get started. So what is DevOps? I know this is, and if you have any questions, of course, you can save them. We'll answer them at the end. We know you probably have some real good ones about what you're facing with day to day. DevOps is I think Blanca, you said this, it's an answer you're going to get from, that's going to be different from everybody. But in the core of what it is, right? You're integrating your development, you're integrating that with operations, and it's not a new concept for Salesforce. It is the software development lifecycle, right? It's the ability to deliver, features and core services of applications to the business, your end users, right? And having your operations and your development teams working, not only working in tandem, but also getting the understanding that each piece of this, infinite loop is cyclical. Just because you deploy something doesn't mean it's done. DevOps and Agiles coexist together, right? I think a lot of problems, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, a lot of problems we see about DevOps come from how a team is running on Agile. Are they doing things like, clear product ownership? Are they maintaining a backlog? Do they know what's going to be in a release? Those are very influential on what we normally see as release management issues, but it's much easier to blame the technology than it is to blame the process. The goal, of course, with DevOps is to release faster, more reliably, with lower risk, right? And that's a very lofty goal sometimes, depending on the organization. There are definitely organizations out there that release continuously. There is no date. I have automation in place, testing in place, various quality gates in place in order to just push something to production. It is a great goal to have, but it's not suitable for every organization, especially within compliant environments. And then finally, as I said, DevOps isn't a new concept. It's been around for a while, or DevSecOps even. But Salesforce is a bit unique. And I think it's unique because of the evolution of what DevOps has become and what the platform has become over the past 20 plus years. We can move on to the next slide. So why is it tough? Why is it challenging? Why is it unique? Okay. And these are probably the biggest buckets I see when it comes to getting in front of somebody and explaining, no, you can't just turn on a Jenkins, script, create it and let it go, because there's a bunch of things that kind of influence the nurturing that's necessary in order to get this right. The first and foremost to me is metadata dependency. Deployment requires knowledge, and the application itself doesn't always know what is needed when deploying a component. And those semantics of, if I deploy an object, I might need this field, or I might need a related field from a related object. These tools out there are help to kind of resolve some of those dependencies. Source tracking has gotten a bit better when it comes to dependencies, but there's always a need, especially as metadata versions change, to evaluate whether or not you have everything you require within a package or within an artifact to deploy it, right? And that creates deployment issues if you don't have everything. To this day, destructive changes and rollback are unique operations. They are not the same thing. So if I create a deployment with a CI/CD tool, I also have to create a rollback or destructive change script with that CI/CD tool as well. And of course, the behavior is different depending on what you're trying to roll back. Can you just flat out delete something? Sure. But do you want to, right? Have you maintained a history of a pickless field? That's something that's a bit odd when it comes to trying to deal with the different nuances of the different components on Salesforce. This is my favorite, the database configuration. There was a time where there wasn't custom metadata. It didn't exist. And so in order to resolve that issue, ISV partners created tables to house data. They could be in JSON format, they could be actual data, but it's not metadata. And because of that, you need a data way to deploy these things. And conventionally, most CI/CD doesn't require that data component. It's usually an afterthought. It's usually I need to populate test data. And because of the relationship of sandboxes to the production environment, things change across those environments. So you can't just pick one thing up and drop it off to the next. So modern tools now are bringing in more data-focused changes across these environments as well in order to be more fully comprehensive on CI/CD. Platform releases is the one that we always talk about 3 times a year. We all deal with it. Metadata changes amongst different environments, different kind of ways that the metadata pulls depending on what you're using. We had an issue today where the CLI would not connect with an environment for some reason, but there was an update over the weekend to the SFDX package. It happens, right? But that means your scripts will fail, right? Anything that's leveraging that CLI is going to fail. So you just have to be aware of the fact that Salesforce does change, and not only during releases, but more often than that. Sandbox idiosyncrasies. Each sandbox is different. There's some with data, there's some without data. Some need to be refreshed before release, some need to be refreshed after release, right? You're always going to fight that battle of planning out your sandbox strategy. And guess what? It's going to change. What you go with day one is going to be different 3 months from now. It might be different 2 weeks from now, because different requirements from different business units are always going to ask for something that you may not have accounted for within your pipeline. So being aware of those changes and how to manage them is probably one of the toughest things, because there is no right answer. There's many different ways to solve this problem. And you just have to be creative and informed on how you're going to approach them in the future. And then finally, there are other challenges now. Profiles are the bane of all of our existence. I'm so glad permission sets are becoming more, the center point of permissions. Obviously, they're not going to completely go away, but overriding profiles has been a problem since day one, as well as layouts. I know a lot of teams that actually will do profiles, layouts, and any kind of permissions as a subsequent release, as to not bolt them into the existing package because it may cause more problems than it's worth. How many people here have sat through a environment and compared 2 profiles with a tool to make sure that when you deployed something, you didn't inadvertently expose or unexpose something? We've all been there. It's not fun. So let's go to the next slide. So that's why Salesforce is different. That's why we have tools like Hapado and GearSet, and we have all these wonderful SFDX add-ons and extensions. There's just so much out there, and that's going to solve some of the problems. But as I said earlier, about Agile and DevOps, there is an alignment here when it comes to governance. And I think this is the the number one thing that we come in at when we're talking about DevOps. It's if you don't manage and approach your Salesforce application in a governed way, no matter what you do, no matter what tools you use, you're going to face issues. You're going to always face a problem. And the problem comes in with knowing what you're building, where you're building it, why you're building it, and when you're going to deploy it. Because that's where you start seeing the clashing of metadata, the clashing of Apex code, right? It's if I'm not aware of what my devs are doing and when that code is going to be deployed, I don't know when to merge that code. I don't know when to merge those, components. And so you have to be, it all starts from day one. You have to have that governance sitting above your application to understand that these are the things that we're going to tackle. Here's the expectation of what's going to be built. Here are the KPIs we're trying to bring to the business. And more importantly, here are I would say the ripple effects of doing this within the environment itself. If I'm working on something on the account object and you're working on something on the account object, I think I'd want to know that. So it's that planning and that knowing which features you're going to use within the application that has to happen up front in order to make sure that you do have seamless releases. Sure, some companies, and I haven't run across them, but some companies do have the ability to have more, we'll say segmented or blocked out code where they have things like feature flagging and dark deploys, but that takes a lot of planning up front as well. It just doesn't happen. So either you're planning a release or you're planning your architecture or you're planning your sprint, right? You all have to come to the same table and figure out when things are going to be developed, deployed, and managed as you approach your Salesforce application. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so one of the core components here, and I referenced it earlier, was environment strategy. And I like this slide, and thank you, Blanca, for putting it together, because it does kind of show the different flavors, and the colors kind of indicate that, of the different sandboxes and sandbox types that are out there, right? We all know, we can go through them. They all have different refresh timelines. They all have different data components, right? But the key takeaway here is you're going to find what works for your team. And as I said earlier, it will change over time. In this example, what we're showing here is that you can have 3 different types of dev sandboxes, right? It could be a dev pro, it could be a scratch org. But in the end, you're going to have to push that code together. I think, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. You're going to have to push that code together at some point, right? And one of the things that we like to, and you might have heard this term of shifting left, one of the things we like to help our clients out with is to understand that the earlier you try and merge this code together or merge these components together, the easier they're going to be able to test, and the less work you're going to have later when you're trying to take more than one component or thousands of components and push them together, right? So we're calling out here the understanding that you're going to want your developers to work in an environment on their own, right? Another thing to consider is low-code developers. They might work shoulder to shoulder in one of these environments with a regular developer. They might spin up their own scratch org and work in those, right? So this accounts for low-code, pro-code development on the platform. And each of these sandboxes have their unique uses. Again, there isn't necessarily a right answer here. If my end-to-end testing and my performance and scale testing needs a full set of data, I'm probably going to use a full sandbox. Do I have more than one full sandbox lying around? Some people do. You might be able to use that within the QA environment. You might need a hotfix environment that relies on data to understand that there is a problem within production, right? But the more visibility you have into what each environment is for, the more you define that up front, the easier it'll be to be able to say, hey, I think I really need to do X, Y, or Z with this environment. And oh, wait, I need to refresh this set of environments because we have a new release coming out. But again, environment strategy isn't just about connecting them. It's about planning their use and planning who's going to maintain them. And then, who's going to actually be able to enter them and do stuff in them. And that's it's really just it. And there's no straight answer here. I just want to make everybody aware that you really have to listen to what your development teams are doing and how they work in order to make them successful.
Tom, can I just emphasize one thing? Because I know I remember being an admin at a very small organization and being very new to Salesforce and this whole concept of having, sandboxes. And so the before is in here intentionally, right? Because some people are still making changes in production. Some people don't even have a sandbox that they're developing in and then moving it to production after they're being tested. But, we want everyone to know that we start somewhere. The thing is to understand what it could look like so that you can drive conversations and that leadership to get you to a healthy point as a team, and how this environment strategy can be fruitful for your team.
Yeah. And I think that's a good call out too, is sometimes you have to make the case for this. If there's one thing we've learned is because DevOps, when done properly, is so unseen, it still takes a village to manage and maintain something like this. So yes, in the sake of simplicity, it might be easier to just have one environment and move it into production. But when it comes to the rigor and the consistency of deploying something, you really need to kind of think through all the use cases, all the testing, as well as all of the different teams that are around and available to help out when it comes to pulling something together that's in that after. So it's not without its own set of maintenance and oversight in order to build something like this. We can move on, unless I can. So here's some early concepts around deployment. What you see on the left is what we have been doing with Salesforce for many, many years, right? I can literally take changes from one environment and push them out into another environment. We can use a change set. We can, pull that down with, we used to use Ant, right? The Force.com migration tool. We have SFDX, right? So there are ways to just take components from one environment. Maybe they come down onto your personal computer, maybe they don't, and just push them into another one. We call that, the org-to-org development model. It is literally the source of truth is the dev org, and then it moves to the next source of truth, which is we'll say the dev pro, the consolidated org. Change sets obviously are still around. You can still use them. They have their own limitations. I know Salesforce is now moving towards DevOps Center, which is supposed to be a replacement for change set. I'm excited about their roadmap. I do hope that it becomes more robust. It already is a lot better than compared to change sets, and it's a step in the right direction. The concepts on the right, however, is focused on what we call source-driven development, right? So, a source deployment model. And this has been around for years. In many ways, we had always been doing some semblance of taking what we consider the source of truth, which is the environment, and pulling it down to somewhere, whether it's an Eclipse IDE, a VS Code. You might have even been pulling it into a repo on your desktop, right? And so the point of source, though, is you're trying to marry two things. You're trying to marry the fact that Salesforce will always be a source of truth, whether you like it or not. There will always be things within a Salesforce environment that can change depending on where you're doing it. But if I want to adopt a more source-driven development model, I need to acknowledge that I need to go with standard practices when it comes to DevOps and SDLC, which is I need an environment where my developers are not only testing their code within the Salesforce environment itself, but also being able to push that code into a place where I can manage when and how it moves into another Salesforce environment, right? And that's all it is. It's being able to take what you consider the source of truth for your environment. It could be all Apex code. It could be Apex code and objects. It could be Apex code and profiles, right? What you decide what is your thing that you need to monitor, maintain, and manage, and you put that within a source control tool like GitHub, like Bitbucket, and you are now using that as your source of deployment. You're not physically moving things from one environment to another with a change set. You are telling that source control, and you're pointing to that source control and saying, use these packages and point them into this Salesforce environment. Okay, so you're just shifting from moving things from environment to a repository to environments, right? And with that brings a lot of advantage. It brings repeatability, right? If I could deploy from a branch on a source control repo, I can then repeat that deployment in multiple places. If I try that with change sets, I have to rebuild the change set every single time unless I'm deploying from one environment only. So it allows for a lot of more repeatability, it allows for a lot more consistency, and it's less error prone. And it also exploits errors much more quickly than before you go and validate something against an environment. And so when we think about source, and we can move on to the next slide, which is about branching strategy, this can get pretty hairy pretty quickly. So I'm not going to dive into it too deeply. As I said, there are always going to be two sources of truth here, right? Whether we like it or not. The environment itself will be in some capacity, a source of truth. I can go into that environment and make changes. And once those changes are made, I have to determine whether or not those changes make it to my other source control system, right? So there's always been this kind of dueling banjos of source within the Salesforce environment. And part of that dueling banjos is, how do I marry an environment with a branch? And a branch, all a branch is just literally that. It is a subfolder within a repository that represents code, okay? And I can determine whether or not I want those branches to look a certain way or not a certain way. And so we can get into things like trunk-based development and environment-based, a trunk-based model or environment-based model. But the crux of what we're trying to say here, and Blanca, I might ask you to chime in a little bit too on this, is every branch in your repo doesn't have to represent an environment, right? A branch can represent the changes you are making to your source code, right? And in this case, if I created a workflow or a flow, my feature branch should represent what that flow looks like within metadata. It is then up to me whether or not I either A, deploy that code to an environment, or B, deploy that code to another branch, taking advantage of all the things that GitHub and Bitbucket can bring you, right? Merging that code, doing pull requests, right? Get it there first, and then attempt to deploy it to another environment, right? So your branching strategy really depends on two things. One, it depends on your tool. There are certain tools that already do this for you, like Capado. I don't even have to think about branching strategy with Capado. I just turn it on and it has its own way of dealing with it. And then there are other tools, and including homegrown, where you can determine whether or not you want to go with something more traditional DevOps, which is, like I said, feature branching and trunk-based development as examples, or you can still manage this model. There are hybrid models. There's a ton of information on this, but the goal is to be consistent on how you treat these branches when they get merged and when they get deployed to your higher environments. Because the more branches you have, the more you have to kind of keep up with this dueling banjos, as I said, of environment to branch strategy. And sometimes you might inevitably just refresh a sandbox and have to update the branch anyway, and that's a completely different thing. So you have a lot of tools at your advantage here. I would just say be thoughtful around what this looks like, and try to go as simple as possible day one, because the more branches you have, the bigger headache, in my opinion, you're going to have. But I'm open to criticism there.
I just want to add and reemphasize, you mentioned this before already, but the goal is, as you're moving away from org to org development and using chain sets and getting into more source format, source driven, and using branching strategy to have shorter lived branches, right? You don't want a branch that is growing over months and months and now it's a year and you're still using the same branch. This is why it's better to have, if you can have your developers in separate environments and moving their feature branches, their bodies of work in that feature branch, and then they come together for certain environments and you're doing these merge conflicts to send, a promotion up of a body of work that maybe is a combination of 2 or 3 different people at the same time. These strategies will change as your needs change. So it may be that you start off very small, you do one feature branch at a time, and you move on up as you're needed. But it also allows for you to have other controls as part of this, like approval processes. So who's doing your code reviews? Do you have automation in place to drive that? So it's not a manual trying to hound somebody down who maybe is on vacation saying, can you review this for me, right? Let the tools that you're embracing to support these strategies and these processes help you out. And that's one of the key takeaways for this as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. The automation aspects of this, again, GitHub, Bitbucket, right? These source control tools have been around for a long time, right? So you're going to be less challenged with their activities and their concepts than you are with applying Salesforce to those concepts. So as much as you want to rely on your people, because yes, inevitably you're going to need a person to look at this. In my opinion, the earlier you merge, the more consistent it could be higher up within your pipeline, and that you can probably more than not rely on automation, because once you validated a package once within a lower environment, as long as your environments are consistent, which I know there's drift, it happens, you can more than likely deploy to those environments a lot easier than trying to do that, towards the end, where everybody's bringing everything together right before a UAT environment or right before even a production push. And then on the next slide, this isn't necessarily prescriptive, but one of the things around environment strategy, and we did talk about this a little briefly, was testing strategy, right? I would say testing, at least really sound testing and automation, is your friend there as well. It gets overlooked a little too much, in my opinion. I think it's easy to create a unit test, call it a day, and say I did it. But I know there's a lot of rigor that's involved. There's a lot of people that's involved when it comes to actually going through all these types of tests. So I would say recommend just evaluating environments, using these environments for the purposes that they're built, right? And establishing what that purpose is. And that way you are creating a space where you can start doing test automation. You can have your QA teams, ensuring that what they're testing is reflective of what production might look like. There's always a lag, within these environments sometimes, because you're trying to balance moving forward, deploying things, getting things done within your sprint, and also having the ability to ensure that you're testing things as they would look as part of a deployment. So having multiple environments, really defining what these tests are, and documenting them is just critical here. And there are different tools that fit into all of these different buckets here. I'm not going to go into them, but nothing beats just a good test strategy and understanding what all the requirements are for those tests, including data, and then more importantly, how you're going to manage that moving forward as your code base gets bigger. And that's really the thing. So if you start early as you're building out your architecture, then you can also scale out your test strategy to match that architecture. So anytime I add a new functionality to, let's say, an opportunity object, right? I have a suite of, we'll call them sales tests that I run as part of a deployment. Well, I can just continue adding to those sales tests. If they're manual, it takes a little longer, but if they're automated and you can start enhancing upon those, there's really great stuff coming out around automated testing now in Salesforce. I suggest you take it and look at it that way. Anything I missed on that, Blanca?
No, and there will be more stuff coming out. Salesforce is actually hosting DevOps like masterclass series. And so this is kind of a model after that. And they'll be doing one for the US soon. They've done a few other regions in the world first, but there is a link to some of their resources in case you wanted to get some more information on these.
Okay. And one of the, well, not one of the last things, but one of the things we did want to highlight is what the difference is between the metadata API and source format, right? I think it's one thing to call out that the metadata API and the source format underneath the hood are pretty much not the same, but they're the same, right? If it works in the metadata API, it typically works in source. But we wanted to kind of highlight the differences between the two, because for a while there, and some people might still be using the metadata API format, based on the tools that they have, and others might be using source format. But for a while there was a transition that needed to happen. The source format was built with source control in mind, right? That's why it's called that. And the main difference being, instead of one giant, file that has everything within an account, or we'll say an account object within that one file, it has been now broken out into more structured, we'll say a file format. So it lends itself to more, we'll say, composable forms, right? Not only within Salesforce as architecture, but also within source control systems. So if I can more granularly compare two files, what are we doing within a code merge within Git, right? We're literally comparing two files, right? And so that's where the metadata API would typically fail, is you're comparing a file against another file that has more than what you need to look at. And guess what? The order of those files may not be the same, depending on when you pulled it and how you pulled it. And so the source format's main purpose, not to mention that it's much more usable with CLI tools and scripting and things like that, was that it is now a more consistent way to be able to pull what we consider metadata onto and into a version control system, right? So if you see your Force app and you see your objects and your triggers separated in that way, where you're not just getting a dump of every single object, the account will have a list of fields, the account will have a list of layouts and things like that. So there's a lot more flexibility there. We wanted to make sure that we just called it out, because you may not know what you're using currently, but there's a way to kind of disseminate between the two.
And the other thing is, as your team is growing, right, if you're not using some of these tools, I know Tom mentioned Capato, but there's GearSet, there's FlowSum, there's AutoRabbit, there's a whole wide array of these tools, right? You want to know, when you're vetting them, what are they using? What are your options? What does that mean for you and where your team is at right now, right? So that you can make sure you're preparing for that change management and training and best supporting teams as you're adopting new tools. So big takeaways is to that the Salesforce well-architected framework, which is available publicly online, and they're always updating, does say, in order for your systems to be resilient, they really need to make sure that they are composable and adaptable. And so embracing the source format is, one of their preferences for teams moving forward.
Yeah, and I would say most tool sets at this point are moving away, if not have already moved away, from metadata, especially when you start getting into concepts like package-driven development, which is another call out within well-architected. It's going to be a lot easier to manage that at scale using the source format. All right, Blanca, I believe I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can walk us through the next section.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So I know we have just dropped a whole bunch of concepts, and they're not all of them. There are more than what we covered, but we wanted to make sure that depending on where you're at, and maybe you're at the very beginning, this is a journey. Our companies and our teams are different sizes. Sometimes we have team players wearing multiple hats. Some companies have more resources than others. The goal is not to envision DevOps and a transformation with DevOps to be a sprint. This is not something that you want to rush into and think that, oh, I can buy a tool and magically that tool gets implemented and it solves all of our problems. That is a false misconception of reality. And so I like to share this with a smile, because most of you have shared some of your pain points in the chat and raised your hands when Tom asked questions if you've encountered these pain points. We all are experiencing them at different levels. The goal is to make sure that you're in alignment with what your team needs. Make sure that you're in alignment with what your company's business priorities are, to prioritize which areas you want to invest on this journey for the DevOps transformation. So for most folks, if you are not using a version control system and you maybe have, one developer environment or sandbox environment, and one production org, you're going to be at this not even crawling stage just yet. So the reason why I like to point this out is that in order for you to get to a crawl, you really do need to have some kind of source tracking, and you need a version control system in order for you to build your processes around that to support deploying better. When I say better, it's deploying where it's not taking days and people are not up all night. You're able to go through some of that testing, go through some of those code merges, and work out conflicts earlier on so that deployments are smoother. And you can't really stand up unless you have that in place in the level 1. So moving over to level 2, okay, you have a version control system in place, you have a process in place, everyone understands what that process is, you know that your tools are configured in a way to best support your team and where they are with their environment strategy and branching strategy and testing strategy. And then you're walking, and what you're trying to figure out is, well, how can I get from A to B faster, right? If I'm walking, I want to look at ways, okay, can I get on one of those conveyor belts in the airport that just I can walk and move forward quickly on? This is what you want to do. Look at how you can configure those tools so that you can have some test automation. Maybe it's not doing test automation, triggered and running all on its own, but maybe it's easier to help support the manual part of the testing that was going on before. You want to look at ways to automate to help you move faster and more efficiently, because then once you avoid the manual steps, manual testing, and you have automation in place, then you can get to running. And we're picking up speed. And here you're really looking at, okay, how can I maybe embrace some tools like Capado robotic testing, where you are programming it to do the testing for you. There's still this person, human part of maintaining it, setting it up, and it needs to be governed, right? But it's not going to take a long time for one person. You can have it run overnight while people are sleeping and enjoying their rest. But you want to make sure you're looking for ways to really leverage the systems where it may be, okay, you want to schedule it, start running the test now, or you want to click of a button and it starts doing its thing. Your team can decide what that automation trigger should be like for the different parts of your DevOps that you want to automate, but you need it to be in place for you so that it's doing things smoothly, quickly, and you're having to pay a little bit less attention. I don't want to say you don't have to pay any attention to it, but a little bit less. And then you get into this kind of other stage of like fly mode. I have yet to meet anybody who's in fly mode. And I'm always very intrigued when I talk to people who have shared parts of their journey and how they've gone on from one stage to the next. But that fly mode, you all are really rock stars if you can get there, in not only, thinking through what Tom said about how can we make sure that when we're deploying and we're releasing, that it's very modular, right? It's composable enough. We have all of the automation in place. It can run and deploy on its own at a certain point, and you don't need all the manual purview around it. That really does take a lot of work. And at the first slide, when we said, what is DevOps? The truth of the reality is that the tool that you choose, or various tools that you choose to support you on this journey, is only going to count for 20% of this journey. The other 80% is on people and processes. So this is a journey that's going to take, not just one person coming in and saying, this is the way we need to do it, or it's the highway. It's going to take a collective to make sure that it is adequately reflecting not only the needs of your company, but your team as well. And your team changes over time, and your business priorities will as well. So this is definitely a journey. It is not a destination. It doesn't end. You're always continuously iterating, like in an agile way, to success. We can advance, Rachel. And here I want to start going through what are some of the common elements of DevOps success. And I like to spend time on these because Tom mentioned before the tooling and these strategies and the governance and all that we talked about up until this point are only part of it, right? I think one, we have to realize that we're human and we're creatures of habit, and depending on your organization and the culture of your company and then the culture of your team can vary. And one of the things that you really need, and this was part of that governance slide earlier, is this shared mission and vision, and everyone knowing what the goals are and what is our process and our strategy to get there. And teamwork does not go very far unless you have trust and transparency and respect. We need to understand that, with this process of embracing any level of DevOps transformation, it really is going to take a lot of sweat. It's going to take a lot of work. Sometimes you're going to have a little boo-boo and you're going to, get hurt, and you'll have to learn how to avoid making the same mistakes again. But your culture at your company and that of your team is very, very important to the success. And you need to make sure that the cultures are embracing this, collective of how we work together. How are we having open lines of communication? How do we best lean on and support each other? Because every team member will do their part and contribute in the specialization area that they are there for, but it will be the whole team that's taking part of this, and it's being governed and driven, by the business. And last but not least, but make sure that you can adapt to change, because that's a key component to this. Rachel, we can advance a slide. Leadership. If you have a great culture, but you don't have the executive leadership to support all that this DevOps transformation is going to require, you're going to have a hard time. Who here on the call, raise your hand if your team has been struggling with DevOps and you're trying to find a way to invest in some tooling, and right away the question is, well, how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? Do we have somebody who can manage this? Well, this is a challenge that a lot of us see. And again, it's something that you need to make sure that you can understand the benefits of why a DevOps transformation can bring the change that you need, not only to make sure that your team is working more succinctly and efficiently, but it's also a better way of working. And a lot of times, you have to find somebody within not only your own team, but an executive level sponsor that can be there to have your back, that can go and advocate to get the sign-offs for the funds that you need to spend, or the people that you need to hire with those specialization areas within, maybe you need someone to lead QA and there isn't anybody already in-house that has that. Well, you need to have someone who has the executive leadership to influence and get things approved and have the financial backing. So that your team can go through this transformation with the proper support. And the commitment from management is key. A DevOps champion, this can vary, but it's very important. You need one person, whether they're on the technical side or on the operation side, but you really need someone who is working very closely with the software development team and who can be the champion for that team and be a liaison and work with the executive sponsor and the other stakeholders that are necessary. And then with that leadership, it's understanding, how do we align our DevOps priorities in what we're trying to change with DevOps? How does that align to the business priorities? Are we trying to get better in certain areas of our business? And maybe it's part of, how good are we working with bringing answers to people who are inquiring to buy our services, or maybe it's on the support side. And maybe some of your functionality of what you need to focus on is how can we deliver faster and more efficiently, right? So you have to figure out how to align what your needs are as a development team up with the business. And then that leadership will help you lead the way together.
And
Next slide.
I would just chime in, Blanca. This time goes back to that governance, aspect, right? And it's the concept that the business, the IT, the stakeholders, this applies to Salesforce and any major application within an enterprise portfolio. But you use those avenues of collaboration to discuss these important concepts, right? Just as much as I'm sure groups and teams talk about whether or not to invest more within, a cloud or invest more within a set of integration appliances, right? You need the visibility of the development cycle and as it lives within a COE is your first step towards having everyone understand that it's critical to devote time, money, and resources to this problem, right? Because the first thing you hear from the business is, and I know this is cliche, but IT takes too long. I send in a request and it's never, right? They don't know the heroics going on. They don't know the late night deployments that happen, right? We've all been there. When we work with a customer who gets this, the difference is just palpable. Like, it's amazing on how much easier it is to get wins when the customer has already identified that this is a problem and they are going to solve it together. So I would say everything you can to elevate and escalate these types of things that you probably deal with all the time to those people who are asking for more and asking for faster delivery and more quality, because this cuts right into it.
Yeah, and we can advance to the next one. So one of the things that we keep calling out is, what is your team going to need? What resources? Resources isn't always in another technology, right? It really comes down to, especially for DevOps success, do you have the expertise and do you have, the people with the drive and the passion to focus within these buckets of work within the DevOps space, right? So if you come from smaller teams like that of I did in nonprofit, and then when we got to higher ed, we grew and we were a little bit bigger team, but we didn't have a team quite as big as on this slide. And I'm not putting this up here to make anybody feel bad. It's a reality, right? We're sometimes very small and mighty teams trying to figure out how can we reshape the ways that we work and look at filling tasks and activities and bringing expertise within each and every one of these areas. So the goal of this slide is really to show that it's not just one person working in a cubicle managing this in a silo on their own. This really does need people, and sometimes a few people may wear two hats. It all depends on the shape of your team, but these are all the type of roles that you should see reflected amongst, who's on your team and what hat are they wearing. The one thing that I do like to point out is that very often you'll see that we'll have leadership not really understanding why we need to hire, or either hire more internally or to hire out and get consultants, or in other areas they're not always understanding why we need those resources. And the truth of the matter is you can't be an expert in all the areas. It's just too vast and there's too many areas of specialty within. But what you could do is know enough to be able to advocate for what it is that you need and be able to identify what types of roles that your team will need to look at adding on as you grow, and knowing who your people are, know what they're good at, know what they aspire to get working into, figure out how that works with your internal DevOps needs, and can there be someone who moves into another area who's, maybe taking on a role of something new that your team didn't have before, and maybe they can upskill somebody else to take over some of their responsibilities. But the goal is not to put all the responsibility on one or two people. So that's one thing that we like to share here about this. We can advance to the next slide, Rachel. This is very important. I think when I read the Gear Set State of DevOps report this year, the one thing that really resonated with me, and it's a passion area of mine, and why I'm a user group leader and why I partake in leading the Red Women program, but training is very important. That DevOps State of DevOps report stated that the percentages was very high for teams that did training often, like once a month. They did better. They were more successful. Reasons why? They knew what the process was. If there were changes that needed to be incorporated to get more efficient as you're iterating to success with DevOps, they were up to speed because they had somebody training them and showing them this is the areas we're going to change and pivot a little bit that'll work better for us. So training is actually part of something that everyone will need. It's not just a let's train them when we first buy a tool and then that's it. The training needs to encompass more than just how do you use the tool, but really how the process for DevOps, what are our policies, who's doing what at which times. These are all important parts. And your team should be open to always learning because things are always changing. Just as often as we have releases, there's new tools and new features within those tools and new ways of iterating to success for DevOps that they need to pick up with. Next slide, please, Rachel.
I would just add to that, recognize your different developer personas. Recognize that you have low code, no code, everybody is a developer in some capacity. And there are deviations on your process. So map it out and understand what a day in the life of somebody who's going to be part of a high efficiency team is going to need to do when it comes to them making changes within their Salesforce environment. And to Blanca's point, you learn from it. You use those examples and mapped out and see what works and what doesn't work. You might go too far and nobody can get anything done, or you might not go far enough and people are still making changes within environments they shouldn't. But spend the time thinking through the types of changes and the individuals who are making those changes in order to put a strategy together that works for all involved. Because that's the other thing. You end up leaving individuals behind when you don't consider them developers.
Very well stated, Tom. Thank you. And then here, this is key because one, all right, Blanca, Tom, you not only told us about all of these technical concepts and these strategies we need to learn about, you're telling us that we also need to think through our culture. Well, how are we going to support if we need somebody to come in and help us understand our organizational culture to improve it for our team so that we can improve what we need for DevOps. And then you're telling us we may need tools and we are going to need to train our staff, and that maybe means pay for some courses or pay for some certifications. And all right, well, how is this all going to get funded? Because that's one of the biggest questions your executive sponsor is going to ask you. It's like, okay, well, you're asking me for XYZ resources. How much is it going to cost? What is the plan, for this? And one of the things that you're going to have to say is, hey, we have metrics. We're collecting data on how not good we're doing right now. And that's a good thing. If you're collecting data to point out where your pain points are, if you know where in your DevOps are you struggling, are you guys releasing quickly, but you're introducing too many bugs? There are these different bottlenecks. And so if you can leverage data that you're collecting on these areas to articulate, all right, this is what we have in metrics on showing where we are. These are the areas for your business KPIs that we need to best support. And the way that our team is going to be able to achieve that is if we have your backing to improve these, and then keep tracking those metrics so that you can go back to that executive sponsor and your team and you can celebrate the victories and seeing that you're improving and your metrics are going up. So please do know not just your internal team's metrics, but DORA, which is the DevOps Research and Assessment. It's a Google huge arm around DevOps, and they have a lot of information about the metrics there. You can go and visit, but learn what they are, learn what you should be tracking. If you're not already collecting data, start collecting it, because collect the hours. How many people for one deployment is getting caught up on just figuring out the merge conflicts or whatever piece is providing the biggest pain points, because that dollar translation of how much time and money we're wasting because of this hurdle, they're going to be more inclined to want to support you, so that you can then in turn get better and you can help support the business overall with their KPIs. And then feedback loops. Always look at the data, be a data informed team and company, and use them to help you drive your decisions. Rachel, next slide, please. This one is one of my favorites because I've pivoted quite a bit. I told you how I started off in nonprofit, a smaller team, went into higher ed, and then into consulting, and now specializing in the DevOps space. It's a challenge, and I do think it is fun work, Tom. I know that some people are like, oh, this is a headache, and I had to figure this out. But the part that I love the most is that if you have your eyes open and you're able to see and look at what the real picture is, that what really is going on, you can figure out who you need to have conversations with, what other people and what other data or information or tools maybe do you need to look at. But there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to re-envision how you're doing your work and getting better at it. And then when your team stops having those overnight deployments and are not having all the headaches, there's going to be a great success in that. And that's the part that I find that's the most fun. It will take time. It will be a challenge, but I promise you, you can find the resources to, get through it, so long as you have the right support and buy-in from the executive sponsors, and your team is understanding that everyone has ownership of different pieces and will contribute to this. You are not alone on a boat trying to figure this all out. Next slide, please. So adapting and iterating to success. And then here, points of failure. It sounds like it's a very negative thing, but in reality, you can think of it as the cars. When the cars are being manufactured, they'll do the testing, especially on the newest models, right? They'll do extra testing to see how does it do if there was a crash. And I look at these because I like to be in a safety car. I also have a family, so I'm maybe a little bit more protective than some people who are speed demons like my sister. But those safety tests are actually really good, right? It's a safe way to experiment and see what are the points of failures, what parts of the framing or how the car is built do we need to take a look at and change so that we can make it better and make it safer and more efficient and stronger. And so points of failure is something that I think we should look at embracing and know that we'll just fail quickly. If you make a mistake, it's okay. Don't dwell on it. Don't beat yourself up for months and months. Start thinking outside of the box and looking at how can we find the root cause and how can we, and I'm using the word we as a key here because it's not onus on one person. It's not blame on any one person. It's a collective in getting through and looking at what are the problems and how we could make it better. Next slide, please. Last but not least, resources. There are so many topic areas and so many other tips and tricks and some more technical things that you might need to understand that we can't cover in this session. But we're leaving you with not just Salesforce branded free resources, but there's also additional free resources from some of the vendors out there in the ecosystem. So you can actually visit. They have learning platforms that like Trailhead, but they can be a little bit of a hybrid where they'll teach you about their system and how it works for DevOps. And some of them are more tool agnostic topics, which I really appreciate because one, I want to understand the mechanics of DevOps. I want to understand, not just the vocabulary, but like branching strategies. I may also need to think about release management. That's a topic we didn't cover here today because we probably can have 3 sessions on that alone. But these are resources that you can go and check out on your own time. And Ladies Be Architects has a development lifecycle study group. So you can go ahead and check that out. And I launched a Women in DevOps book club. So if you're interested, you can sign up to be part of that as well. And I think we can open it up to questions and answers. I saw we had some good ones that came in earlier on.
I just wanted to show some quick architect resources, Blanca, and then we did have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
So just wanted to show these architect resources. There's a lot, like Blanca shared with DevOps. There's so many Salesforce architect resources. So just want to share these links with you. I'm going to stop recording, Blanca, so people can freely ask questions. And then